Hello, my name is Austin. I'm doing this for a YouTube channel or also my video project for English, but I am turning this into a YouTube channel where I explain different conspiracy theories or crimes or different things, just different unsolved crimes, solved crimes, just whatever catches my interest, or fun stories, or games or stuff like that, something that catches my interest, or related to books or something like that. And it could be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It could be I don't know, this book and game called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, because I've seen many videos on it. It interests me and I'd love to talk about it in my perspective, and that's what mostly this drive is. This is just the ways I explain things and the way I incorporate my information, the way I give my information out. This is my way of doing it, my way of explaining things. And this is my book. I'm going to be writing things in. This is where I'm going to be putting my research, putting my my sources as well, because I do source online and I go to different websites and different. As I go on, I will try to find more credible sources, more people to come to me with sources, and that's mainly the whole drive. So let's get into it. I'm doing this after work, by the way, so I'm a little tired, but aren't we all? And this is also my first time doing a YouTube video or any video assignment, so all you're seeing is my top half. I could not be wearing pants. But you don't know that. So let's get into the video. So today we are doing the Zodiac killings between 1968 and 1969. We are also going to go over a possible murder that was done by him in 1966, and then any evidence that could lead to a suspect in 1970. So the murder in 1966 and the notes in 1970 through 1974 are all not sure or not confident to be the Zodiac Killer. Now, if you do not know who the Zodiac Killer is, in which I hope you've heard of him, he was a serial killer between the years of 1968 and 1969, as I've stated before, and he was very notorious for his killings because they happened in rural places, they were very similar to each other, and also because of the string of notes after or almost after every single killing that he's done. And what's more notorious about the notes themselves was the ciphers that came with them, or the unsolvable messages that he put on every one. And there was one that came out, and we'll talk about it more later. It was unsolvable until an ex-reporter or some ex-detective decoded it, and it was very obscure and it was very different than what other motives that other serial killers at the time had. And I say at the time, or I say near the time, because there is a lot of stories of serial killers around this time, and it's pretty dark to hear about all their motives or all of the things that they'd want to kill or why they kill them. And it's really messed up. For some of the motives, there's no motive, and it's just evil. These several string of murders happened in Northern California, and more near the areas of Tracy and Vallejo, and also another area that can't think of at the moment. The first murder we're going to go over is the alleged murder that was made by him in 1966, and that is the murder of Sherry Bates in Riverside, California. Now, in my opinion, I believe that this was the Zodiac Killer because the notes that came after it, these notes were called the confession, and it basically confessed to the murder of Sherry Bates, gave detail, and gave a reason or motive why he killed her. And in that note, which I will talk more about later, it stated that there was going to be more afterward, and I'll give you more reason why I think that note was sent by the Zodiac Killer himself and the murder was made by the Zodiac Killer, but that is only to be discovered. To give description on who the victim was, her name was Sherry Bates, and she was an 18-year-old college student at Riverside College, who, on the night of October 30th of 1966, left a note for her dad saying that she would be going to the library of the said community college. Unfortunately, She never got back home that night. Her car was found abandoned at the college library, while her body was found between two houses not too far from the library itself. In the first weeks of the investigation of her murder, there were no signs of tampering with the body, so there couldn't be said if there was a physical motive for the killing. But other than that, at the time, there was just thought to be no reason why Miss Bates was murdered that night, and it could have just been some low moral serial killer out there. But turning the tide of the investigation, about a month later after her murder, there were a string of notes, just think about 3, that were all titled The Confession. Now, this note by itself is why I think that this killing was made by the Zodiac Killer, because there's just so many obscure things to read about it and obscure things to read in it, and the morals just seem so similar if we get into other notes that he sent in the later murders. Many things were said in these string of notes, such as vile things, accusations, but what most catches my eye is that he said she is not the first and she will not be the last. After that, he started describing how he got Miss Bates to follow him or go with him, and he said while she was in the library that he disconnected certain wires to the car's distributor, which made it incapable of starting. He then begins to describe how he put on a facade to try and get her to trust him. And unfortunately she did, and after he got her to go with him through a lift, saying, "Hey, I'll give you a lift," he proceeded to take her to this very obscure and quiet place and kill her between 2 houses. And he described there being a struggle, but he liked it. And that's just a part of evil that I can't really understand. He begins in the note to say that he'll kill more, and starts mentioning victims and what they do in their daily life. And he mentions in this one, and I will say there's a spelling error that I will correct, and that's what you see in a lot of the Zodiac Killer's notes or letters that he sends. There is a couple of spelling errors, and it could be that they spelled them back then, or they spelled words back then differently, or they said them differently, but that's just my way of connecting this to those notes as well. Because if you read the note like I did, and you read the other notes that he had sent to the news stations and police stations, you'd see that they're very similar, in handwriting, or not really handwriting, as I could say, but they were just similar in the motive that it was written in. It says in the note, or maybe she will be the shapely or sharply blue-eyed brunette that said no when I asked for a date in high school. Brunette also meaning brunette. I don't know if they said it differently back then, but that's a possibility. Other than that, it gives us a pretty clear motive on what he wanted to do or why he killed Miss Bates, because earlier in the note he had said, "But only one thing was on my mind, making her pay for the brush-offs that she had given me during the years prior." Talking about Miss Bates, of course, and talking about how both of these girls had brushed him off or rejected his dates in high school, and that was his motive for killing them or wanting to kill them. Other than all that evidence, there's nothing proving that the Zodiac Killer did this killing and sent this note, but it's of course my opinion, and it doesn't have to be whoever's watching this' opinion, but I'm fully convinced that it is, just because by the way the note was written, by the way the words were given out, by just the dialect. And at the end of the note, he says, "I am not sick, I am insane," and also says, "It was just a warning, beware." All of this being 2 years before the original 5 murders. This is where we get into the first 2 official murders made by the Zodiac Killer in 1968. These murders are the murders of David Faraday and his girlfriend Betty Lou Jensen. On December 20th of 1968, David Faraday picks up Betty Lou Jensen from her house and says to her parents that they'd be back home by 11 p.m. that night. To give a description on the victims, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were 2 high school students that met 2 weeks prior at church where they both went to, And David Faraday basically almost fell in love with Betty Lou Jensen and asked her out almost immediately at church. After Mr. Faraday had picked up Miss Jensen from her house, he had driven to a Lover's Lane area on Lake Herman Road in Benicia, California. It was then that they couldn't follow their promised curfew of 11 p.m. because it was around that time that they did not come back home. After many had reported of seeing them that night throughout the night, there was only one person that had found them dead, and her name was Stella Borges, at around 11:20 p.m. at night. Miss Borges said at the time she was heading to a grocery store with her mother and her child in her car, and while she was passing Mr. Faraday's car, she saw them both laying on the ground, and it was at that moment she went straight to a police station. And unfortunately, if she had stopped to help, Mr. Faraday and Miss Jensen might have been alive today, because at the moment that she was passing them, they were alive at that moment. When police came back to the scene, they found Mr. Faraday and Miss Jensen dead. Miss Jensen was found with 5 bullets in her back and away from the car, as if she was trying to crawl away. And then Mr. Faraday was found right next to the car with a bullet wound in his head. All of these shots were made by a .22 caliber Higgins Model 80 semi-automatic pistol. After that murder, there were any investigation because, again, it was no proof of a motive, no proof of any serial killer identification. There was nothing to look for. And by the summer of 1969, there was really nothing to go off of. It was after the summer of 1969 is where we see 2 other victims of the Zodiac Killer. To give detail on the victims, their names were Darlene Ferris and Mike Mago. Darlene was a diner worker at the time, age 21, and Mike was her friend at age 19. And what they had done was Darlene had picked Mike up after her shift at the diner, and they had went to Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. What happened was, in Mike's report, because he fortunately survived the attack, that Mike and Darlene were sitting in Darlene's car in the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park. It was then that Mike had seen a man enter and leave the parking lot in his car, but had came back and parked a little bit away from them. When the man had exited his car, he exited with a flashlight, and Darlene and Mike just thought it was a cop doing a routine check and were a little less worried than they should have been. It was then that the man had came up to Darlene's car and pointed a 9mm handgun at both of Mike and Darlene. He shot Mike in the jaw, the knee, and the shoulder, and thankfully Mike had survived the attack, and unfortunately Miss Darlene Ferris did not. It was 40 minutes after the attack where police had gotten a call from a gas station payphone where a man was reporting and confessing to the murder at Vallejo, and then also confessing to the murders in Benicia. He described the weapon used in Vallejo as a 9mm Luger handgun, which directly connected him to the murder in Vallejo as it was a 9mm handgun. It was a little after this that notes were sent to the Vallejo Police Department and the news station that it was the Zodiac and he was confessing to the murders. And it was a string of 3 identical, notes. And they were all describing the murder at Vallejo and Benicia, saying what type of gun was used, what ammo was used, where the injuries were of the victim, and the place it was at, and certain positions that the victims were in when they were dead. And it was then where I think that the police felt this overcoming sense of dread, because every description of down to the ammo that was used and the injuries and the placement of the injuries that were there, it was all correct. And there hadn't been any public talking about any of the murders yet, or at least there wasn't specific information out about it. After the 3rd letter was read, it ended the 3-letter-long cipher that came with it. This cipher said, "I like killing people because it's so much fun," and saying that killing people is more fun than hunting wild game, and that when he dies, he will be reborn in paradise, spelled Paradice, as in rolling dice. And this is where I say that the spelling mistakes really connect him to the murder in 1966, because I hadn't mentioned this, that in 1969, and this year, he had sent a note saying and admitting to his Riverside activity. And that's what just really held it together, because it gives him that feel and that notion, and it just connects the motives, and it connects how just similar it all is, because you'll see in the next murder that it really is all similar. This is where we get into our next attack at Lake Berryessa on September 27th, 1969. And then I say attack because one of the two victims actually survived and had managed to get help before both of them died. And unfortunately, one of the two victims had passed away due to her wounds 2 days later, and it was thankfully after she had been able to put in her statement about the attack. I don't have much of a description of the victims at the time, but their names were Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. And the report starts with Brian saying that around 6:30 p.m., he saw a man lingering behind a tree and some bushes a little bit away from them. And he had said the man had came and left. And that is dreadingly shocking to me, because imagine you're laying down next to your partner on a lake and y'all are having y'all's intimate time and y'all are just having fun, and you look over and just you see, I doubt that's what he saw. It could have been way more dreading than that, but that's all I can imagine when I just like imagine you're just like having fun one day and you don't know you're about to get brutally attacked by that man that you see standing behind a bush. It was here Brian states that the man had came back and held the couple at gunpoint. And he said that he had escaped from prison and he had killed a guard. And that's not surprising. That's if you saw what this guy looks like, it's not surprising, because in Brian's description, he said that he was wearing a black executioner style hood with clip-on glasses that he could say he saw through, and saw brown hair, which is also very shocking because that was a reoccurring thing that people said when they said they've seen the Zodiac Killer. And other than that, on the hood was the iconic Zodiac symbol that you see with the circle and the cross. And that was where you see the first police sketches of the Zodiac Killer, and it's where you see that original black mask and the glasses on it. But Brian had said that he had escaped from prison and needed to rob them for their money and the car, in which both Cecilia and Brian complied, allowing them to get tied up. It was after they were tied up where the killer had stood there for a moment and said that he needed to kill them. And he drew out a almost foot-long blade. After that, Brian had realized what was going on and screamed and begged for the killer to kill him first, because he could not see Cecilia getting murdered in that way. And that's where the killer actually complied. He proceeded to stab Brian in the back several times and also proceeded to stab Miss Shepard before leaving. And Brian's method of just staying alive was that if he knew that if he squirmed or gave any resistance or struggle, that the killer would come back and finish him off. And after being stabbed in the back, Brian had stayed still until the killer left. And it was when the killer wrote on their car door the dates of the Benicia murders, the day of the Vallejo murders, and the day of this murder, with the time and the gun that was, the knife that was used. And it's dreading because after the killer had left, Brian had crawled all the way to a nearby road, and somebody who was circling the whole lake on their boat had seen what happened, or really hadn't seen what happened, but had seen after the attack, or the aftermath of it. And thankfully they got help before they were bleeding out, and it was just super sad to read, because when I read the part where Brian begged to be stabbed first, is just where I found, like, these are real people that were hurt by this man, and this is a real case that was basically unsolved, because the prime suspect, I don't even believe he was the person, and it's sad to, read about. It was after this murder that the Zodiac Killer had called the police again to admit to the murder before any public information was given out, just so they knew that he did the murder. And that's just a sign of pettiness that is hate in people, you know. Like, imagine, like, somebody just got killed, and the guy's calling, and he's like, yeah, I did that shit. Bro, what? And after that call, the Zodiac Killer had not been heard of until about a month later on October 11th of 1969, where a man named Paul Stein had died in a taxi. Paul Stein, who was a husband and taxi driver at the time, on the night of October 11th at around 9:30, picked up a man who he thought was a man. He was actually the Zodiac Killer, which that's just unlucky, and I feel really bad saying that, but that is just some horrible luck, man. Like, ooh. After going to the man's destination, which was a rich neighborhood in San Francisco called Paradiso Heights, at around 9:55 on an intersection between Washington and Cherry Street, Paul was shot in the head with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol before the man fled out of the car. The man was said to be around 5'8" and 5'9", also being 5'10" maybe, and having light brown or reddish hair with glasses. And it's really unfortunate because Paul was said to be a victim of a robbery and the suspect was a African-American man. But when, after all of these, you know, hey, this was a middle-aged white man with glasses, brownish red hair, and 5'9" through 5'10", which was the past descriptions of the said Zodiac Killer, the police also said that they saw a man matching that description when they were going to the scene. And that's just so unfortunate because imagine if they had gotten the first description or the actual description of the man first instead of the immediate assumption that it was a robbery, because who knows what might have been their thought process at the time or their guilt afterward. But I can understand. A man just died and it was an urgent call. But I just had to say that's really unfortunate, and that's just a fun fact to know that it was almost caught then and there, but wrong information was given. It was not long after that the murder was proven to be the Zodiac Killer, after the Zodiac Killer sent another letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, and the letter stated, I had killed the man on Washington and Cherry Street, and what really proved it was the bloody piece of shirt from the man that was inside. And that was just shocking, because what more proof can you get out of a literal crime scene? Only one more reporting of the Zodiac Killer, and that was in March 1970. And there were later notes that the Zodiac Killer had sent between 1970 and 1974, and I think it was one of the letters in 1971 where he had mentioned this incident, but you never know, because the letters in 1974 got really weird, and they said that it could have not been the Zodiac Killer who sent the ones at those times, so you never know who could have sent the ones 3 years prior. And that's just something to think about. I'm not sure if it was true or not. I wasn't there, so I wouldn't know. But I just think that going at this with an open mind is probably the best way to do it. So the victim's name, or I say victim, is Miss Kathleen Johns, and she was driving with her child on Highway 185 near Interstate 5 from visiting her mother, I'm pretty sure. And it was near Tracy, California, and that is also in Northern California, mainly near Vallejo. And what happened was a car pulled up behind her and started flashing their lights indicating, hey, pull over. And Kathleen does, and pulls over, and a guy walks out with a car iron and says, hey, your tire was wobbling, but I can fix it for you. And Kathleen accepts, but stays in the car. And the man works in it for about 1 to 2 minutes and comes up to the window and says, hey, you're good to go. Kathleen attempts to drive a little bit, and then her tire completely falls off. This is why I said go at it with an open mind. Because, listen, she pulls back over, and she discovers that it could have been only one lug that was holding the tire there. And that's all. This is why I keep saying come at this with an open mind. Because the man pulls over again and is like, hey, I can give you a lift to the nearest service station. And I understand that Miss Johns might have been thinking ahead and been thinking for the safety of her child. But she accepts, and I'm like, so the guy that pulled you over before probably took the lugs and then is coming back now to say, hey, I can give you a lift. That's pretty suspicious. So I just say, go in there ready to, like, protect your child, of course, but ready to throw hands, right? So, anywho, instead of going to the service station, the man apparently drives around back roads, mainly near the town of Tracy, which was reported. And there's some sources that say that the man was actually really nice, and some say that the man was threatening Miss Johns and her child. And it's so weird, because you can say the Zodiac Killer was actually a pretty nice guy who just took her lugs, was going to kill her with kindness, and then saying that he was going to kill her child, and it was really bad. It was horrible, but, like, from the different sources I've seen. And Miss Kathleen Johns, the dog she is, gained the courage to finally take her child and tuck and roll out the car. She jumps out the car. And another driver that was behind them, pulls them over, picks them up, and takes her to the nearest police station. And just gotta say, Miss Johns, if you're out there, if you're alive, or the daughter of Miss Johns that was in that car, your mother was a dog. That was the last reported see of the Zodiac Killer. And then there were a string of murders in 1973 on August 10th that weren't really connected to the Zodiac Killer due to lack of specific characteristics. And I think that's interesting, because I'm not really going to talk on that, because it's just so much to talk about already than what I've been talking about already. But it's just, yeah, like, I read about it and it was just not close. I just think that it was like some mimic, or just some other crazy guy out there with some lunatic mind. But other than that is the prime suspect, Arthur Lee Allen. Now, this is where my argument comes in. I don't think Arthur Lee Allen did it. Or at least, I don't think he did the killings. He might have sent a letter back in 1973 through 74, but I just don't think he did the killings. But he just had a notorious reputation already. And it was really because he was reported by one of his good friends that he made through his brother, and the reporting was made by a man named Don Shaney. And Mr. Shaney had also reported Arthur Lee Allen of molesting his, young daughter. And that's a pretty big allegation. Or those are two pretty big allegations, sort of back to back. They were a couple years apart. But there were so many things trying to make Arthur Lee Allen the suspect, and I could see them. I understand why they were looking at him, and the report of child molestation, and that's a big trigger word, and that's also just a big thing to talk about, and that's really bad. That already gives him that loss of morals, right? But it's even worse because he was a school teacher at the time, so his career was ruined. But once he started gaining popularity through being the main suspect of being the Zodiac Killer, it's almost like he started bragging about it, saying he was all this big and tough after, being exposed for being a possible child diddler. It was bad. And it was probably why they gave him that reputation, because there was also something that connected him, was a watch that he had that he gained in 1967, and that was 2 years before the original murders. And it was a watch with the word Zodiac and the symbol of the Zodiac, and that was the first reported sight of that symbol and that word in the same exact place. And that was, of course, also the symbol that you see that the Zodiac Killer uses, and the Zodiac is the name. And like I said, I understand where they come up with the characteristics. But there were also a lot of people who also called in and said that they were the Zodiac Killer, or bragged about them possibly being the Zodiac Killer. And like I said, there were letters in 1974 that kind of, weren't the Zodiac Killer. They had different dialect. They had a different motive. They had a motive that, excuse me, they had a motive that didn't match the writing of what the Zodiac Killer's motive had when he was putting down those words. No, it just didn't feel like it. And I read them and I was like, because I read almost every letter to try and get all of this to the best description I can. And comparing the possible murder of the 1966 letter, the confession, and the 3 letters that came out with after the Vallejo murder, that was really the similarity. And then you look at the Vallejo murder, 3 identical letters, and then you look at the 1974 letters, and then you're like, that's a lot of a different characteristic, of a different motive. And that's why I don't think that Arthur Lee Allen did it, because he had so many reasons to brag. And I just don't think that with what he was going through, that wasn't really what the Zodiac Killer's plan to kill people was. It was over revenge of a past, rejection of girls, which is what I'm assuming. And you see it with, the 2 murders of young couples who are alone, having their own intimate time, and it's just revenge. And I guess you can say Darlene and Mike weren't really a couple, because Darlene did have a husband at that time. But, like I said, you never know what could have really been happening, and what Mike could have really saw, or what they could have really been doing. And, again, that's why I also don't think that Arthur Lee Allen was what should have been the prime suspect, because even after that he was arrested, the letters stopped coming, which was after 1974. Like I said, the letters in 1974 did not seem similar to the actual Zodiac Killer letters. So it's with reason that they stopped, because he was trying to gain that popularity with what was happening. And how badly the Zodiac Killer was not coming out, publicly. For all we know, for all we know, he could still be out there. For all we know, he could have died years ago, and we could have never known who it was. And who knows? It could have been right under our noses. Or it could have been Arthur Lee Allen. Who knows? Like I said, who knows? But it's all a conspiracy. And that is where I leave you all. I enjoyed making this video over 2 hours of time after, I got off my job. And I will definitely be doing this again, because as you can see, I just have this love for it. And it's not because I find a thrill in learning about murders. No, that's what people can say. But it's really, I just love telling a story. I love telling true things about history, and that's also just an inspiration I have. But other than that, I have no other reason to say what the Zodiac killings were. I have no reason to put my opinion in anything. I just wanted to tell what happened, how they happened, the truth of it, and my opinion. And that I hope this goes out. I hope people enjoy hearing about this from a different perspective. And that's my plan. So, thank you very much, and I enjoyed my time. It's all a conspiracy.